Well, thank you so much to Yolanda and Vicky for organizing this meeting, encouraging and inviting all of us to come, and especially providing an opportunity for us to come to Canada, which for many of us from the United States is a special honor and privilege at the moment. I have to admit to experiencing a bit of Trudeau envy at present. And actually, thinking about the current political context is a huge part of what inspired the topic that I'll be talking about today. This is actually the first time that I'm presenting data from this part of our project, and I look forward to your comments and whether you think there's something there to pursue more in the future. But with my colleagues, Dina Okamoto, Helen Marrow, and Michael Jones-Correa, we've been working on an interdisciplinary research project relevant to immigration for the last couple of years, and we were thinking about especially given the current political climate in the United States, whether empathy or caring about others is really the same conceptually or different from lack of caring or apathy as we think about others. And so we were reflecting on what literature's out there in our respective disciplines, and we have a pretty well-developed understanding of empathy in social psychology. So we can think about empathy as concern for others and their experiences, or what Stefan and Finlay might call reactive empathy. And this aspect of empathy or empathic concern is associated with greater willingness to help others in need, more positive attitudes towards the disadvantaged, and a greater willingness to support government policies that would benefit the disadvantaged. So we see kind of a good basis or foundation of research on empathy, and specifically this issue of concern for others or empathic concern. But we don't really have a good understanding of apathy, which has been described by sociologists, especially Tyrone Foreman, as a lack of concern for the welfare of others or indifference to the societal inequalities that are experienced by others. And I think we've often just thought about this as kind of the opposite of empathy. But in particular, Tyrone Foreman emphasizes that apathy regarding how other groups are treated, racial and ethnic minorities in particular, is on the rise among whites, that there's just kind of this indifference to how they're treated. I think we see this evidenced in the current election cycle. So a focus of what I want to talk about today is to think about empathy and apathy simultaneously as predictors for attitudes towards immigrants and immigration, and to really have us start thinking about, well, is apathy simply the opposite of empathy, or might apathy play a distinct or unique role in predicting attitudes towards immigrants and immigration? And as we're doing so, we also want to make sure that we're looking at empathy and apathy as predictors of attitudes towards immigration among both white and Black Americans. And there's a bit of research in sociology that would suggest that on average, Blacks tend to report more inclusive attitudes towards immigrants and greater empathy toward immigrants compared to whites, and that whites tend to report greater apathy regarding racial and ethnic issues than non-whites do. And a lot of the research in sociology emphasizes that this is likely due to their relative social positioning in the status hierarchy in the United States. So as we think about whether empathy and apathy might play distinct roles, we also want to think about whether they might play distinct roles in different ways for different groups. Part of the reason why we want to focus on this issue of empathy and apathy in the context of immigration is because, as Yolanda started saying, there are growing numbers of immigrants. Immigration has become such an issue in recent decades, and in the United States we see that new groups of and waves of immigrants are coming to new destinations, different cities and regions in the United States beyond what has been experienced before. And one estimate as of 2015 suggests that immigrants now comprise approximately 13% of the US population. And if you add into that the children that they have soon after they arrive, it's about 20 or 25% of the US population, according to estimates from 2015. But still, we know relatively little about how US-born communities respond to immigrant populations, except for what we've seen in the recent election. Michael Jones-Correa, Dina Okamoto, Helen Marrow, and I have been working for a couple of years now on this major field project in Philadelphia and Atlanta in the United States, where we're looking at contact experiences and relations between immigrants and US-born communities, looking at 4 groups simultaneously. In terms of the US-born, looking at white and Black Americans. In terms of our immigrant groups, we're looking at Mexican and Indian immigrants, purposely to have 2 native-born and 2 foreign-born groups that represent relatively high and low status dimensions. in society. And we have samples of each of these groups. We have 500 random digital telephone surveys from each of the target groups, so that we have a total of 2,000 surveys, with half of each coming from each metropolitan area. And we've also collected qualitative data, including in-depth interviews from members of those different communities in each city, as well as interviews with civic leaders in each city to understand the local and institutional context. I won't be talking about all of these data today, but I did want to explain a little bit why we chose Philadelphia and Atlanta as our research sites. In part, it's because historically, these two cities have been recognized as having long-standing black-white dynamics that are now changing and diversifying with newer waves of immigration. And the largest numbers of immigrants for each city are coming from Mexico and India. And just to give you an example of data from Atlanta, from just a few years ago, here you can basically see the list of countries of birth for different immigrant populations coming to the metro area. And you can see at the very top of that list are Mexico and India, with a particularly large number of immigrants coming from Mexico. So for the focus of the present analysis that I'll be presenting today, I'm just going to be focusing on the data from our white and black respondents, focusing on questions concerning empathy and apathy toward Mexican immigrants in particular, and also looking at attitudes towards immigration. And in so doing, also taking into account a number of demographic variables, including age, gender, political ideology, level of education, and employment status, whether people are employed or not. Just to give you a very brief sense of the demographic characteristics of these samples that we're looking at, you can see we have, fairly balanced numbers of men and women in the sample. We have respondents whose ages range from 18 years to people in their 90s. We have some degree of variability in terms of their political ideology and levels of education, though you can see that on average, or overall, on the whole, there seems to be a larger proportion of whites who would identify as conservative to some degree, and a larger proportion of whites that would have a four-year college degree or higher levels of education. And I just want to very briefly show you these city maps for Philadelphia and Atlanta to give you a sense of patterns of residential segregation in these cities. So the darker areas represent higher concentrations of whites in this slide, and the little green dots represent where our respondents are coming from, so you can see how they're dispersed throughout the cities. And so keep in mind those darkened areas for white respondents as we look at the map for in the next slide for black respondents, where you can see it's almost like a mirror image. Let me show that again. So you can really see how segregated these cities are. To give you a sense of the types of measures that we have included, again, keep in mind this is a telephone survey. We started off with 150 questions, and we had to cull it down to about 80 questions, so we only have single item measures to represent empathy and apathy based on measures that have been used in prior work. So to assess empathy, particularly in relation to Mexican immigrants, we ask, I'm often concerned that immigrants from Mexico are treated unfairly or poorly, to tap into empathic concern. And to get at apathy, using similar measures to those used in sociology, we ask, it's not really my problem if immigrants from Mexico experience unfair treatment or need help. And to give you a sense of how these samples responded to these items, on average, you can see that blacks are reporting greater empathy toward Mexican immigrants than what we see whites reporting. There's also a very slight trend for blacks to report less apathy in relation to Mexican immigrants, though that comparison is not significant. Then we also wanted to look at a couple of different indicators of attitudes towards immigrants and immigration. So we first ask about attitudes towards numbers of immigrants, which is commonly used in a lot of political science surveys. So we say, generally speaking, how do you feel about the number of immigrants in your city today? Do you feel that there's too many, a lot but not too many, or not too many? So using the scale, higher scores would basically mean more positive attitudes about the numbers of immigrants. We also ask specifically about attitudes toward immigration policies for undocumented folks. So our country is in the middle of a debate about what to do with immigrants who don't have legal immigration papers to be here. What comes closest to your view about what to do with immigrants who don't have legal immigration papers to be in the United States? And again, higher scores are representing more positive attitudes towards policies that would support the undocumented, letting them stay in the United States and giving them a path to citizenship. And here we see among whites and blacks that there's no significant difference in their mean attitudes in terms of numbers of immigrants, but we see blacks are a bit more generous in the policies that they would support for undocumented immigrants in the United States. So here we have correlations between all the measures that I've talked about so far, with correlations for whites below the diagonal in brown and correlations for blacks in green above the diagonal. And just to point out a couple of things, first we can see that the empathy and apathy measures are pretty modestly correlated, that there's definitely a relationship there, but they don't seem to be tapping into the same concept. And that's consistent for blacks and whites. And we also see somewhat different patterns emerging in terms of the relationships between empathy and apathy with the attitudes towards immigration measures, showing generally stronger or more robust, consistent relationships among whites than what we see among blacks. So then what we wanted to do was use these empathy and apathy measures as predictors for each of the immigration outcome variables, while also taking into account the demographic variables that I mentioned previously. So we entered, for each group separately, we entered the demographic variables at the first step of analysis, and then entered empathy and apathy as predictors at the second step. So to start off with our responses for whites, we see that political ideology is playing a role, that generally those with more liberal political attitudes tend to be more supportive of, have more supportive attitudes in relation to immigrants. And we also see that empathy and apathy are uniquely predicting those attitudes, and that apathy in particular is playing an important role in predicting whites' attitudes towards the numbers of immigrants, that the more apathetic they are, thinking that, you know, the experiences of Mexican immigrants is not my problem, or it's not something I need to worry about, the more they're likely to view there being too many immigrants, or have less positive views about the numbers of immigrants. Interestingly, we see relatively few effects for black respondents. If anything, we see that empathy is playing a role, and that apathy is less likely to be playing a role in predicting their attitudes. But we only see, you know, more modest effects or trends in terms of the extent to which empathy is predicting more supportive attitudes towards immigrants among blacks. Now, I'm sure many of you won't be surprised to hear that I'm also kind of curious about contact. So we also have many measures of contact that we're working on for a separate piece of the study, where we assess contact frequency, how often they interact with members of these other groups in different social spaces, such as when they're at work, in neighborhoods, or in public spaces like shopping malls, stores, or restaurants. And so we sum those together to create a composite measure, and we also, for each of those social spaces, also have measures of contact quality, or when you're interacting with this particular group at work, in the neighborhood, or around town, such as stores or restaurants, to what extent do you feel that the contact is friendly or unfriendly? And we have a composite measure for that as well. And in some of our other findings, what we find quite consistently, actually, is that the more contact, and even just the frequency of contact, the more contact that each group has with each of the other groups, the more willing they are to welcome those groups into their communities, and the more they're likely to feel welcomed by those other groups. And this is the same whether we look at just the bivariate correlations, or whether we look at partial correlations, including a broad range of demographic variables. So we thought it might be useful to look to see whether there are relationships between these contact measures and attitudes towards immigration measures as well. And so, kind of replicating the previous analysis that I had done, we're doing another set of regressions where, instead of empathy and apathy, we're using contact frequency and quality as predictors after controlling for the demographic variables at the first stage. To start off with white respondents, again, we see political ideology playing a role. And then we see that contact quality is also playing a role in predicting both of these attitudes towards immigrants, that the more they have friendly contact with Mexican immigrants in particular, the more supportive they are about the number of immigrants in their city, and the more supportive they are of letting immigrants stay and have a path to citizenship. We don't see such effects emerging for black respondents. So again, we're kind of seeing this discrepancy that for whites, these feelings of empathy and apathy in particular, and their contact experiences are really predictive of their attitudes towards immigrants, and we're not seeing those same trends among blacks. And I think it's also interesting just to note that among blacks, we're also not seeing the demographic variables popping up either. But that's something we can talk about more later. So then given all the variables that we've talked about so far, we're like, well, thanks to Andrew Hayes, we can do some tests of mediation. So we wanted to see, specifically for white respondents, if the high quality contact that they're having with Mexican immigrants, specifically immigrants from Mexico, is having some predictive value for their attitudes toward immigration through the pathways of empathy and or apathy. So starting off looking at predicting how they feel about the number of immigrants in their city, we see that apathy is playing a partial mediating role. There's still a significant direct effect that more friendly contact with Mexican immigrants leads to more positive attitudes towards numbers of immigrants. But we also see that there's some mediation by apathy, such that higher quality contact, more friendly contact with Mexican immigrants is associated or predicts the extent to which whites become less apathetic about the plight of Mexican immigrants, and that in turn is predicting more positive attitudes towards the numbers of immigrants that are present. We see somewhat similar trends when we look at their attitudes towards policies for the undocumented, that higher quality contact with Mexican immigrants, again, has a direct effect in terms of predicting attitudes towards policies for the undocumented. But we also see that there's partial mediation through apathy, that higher quality contact is associated with less apathy toward Mexican immigrants, and that lower apathy is associated with more positive attitudes towards policies that would support undocumented immigrants in the United States. And we also see a small yet still significant effect for empathy as well, independent of the effect for apathy, that higher quality contact is associated with greater empathy regarding the experiences of Mexican immigrants, and that greater empathy is associated with more support for policies that would encourage or help the undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States and have a pathway to citizenship. So just to kind of pull these together briefly, we can see that empathy and apathy do seem to be playing somewhat distinct roles in predicting attitudes towards immigrants and immigration among the US-born. Granted, a limitation of the present analysis is that we're using single-item measures to assess these concepts. That was all that we could do in order to get the samples that we have. But we think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, but we think that these findings offer at least some evidence that we should pay greater attention to possible distinctions between empathy and apathy as predictors for immigration attitudes in future work. And we also find it quite striking that empathy tends to be more predictive of attitudes towards immigration among blacks, whereas apathy tends to be more predictive of attitudes towards immigration among whites. And we think along the lines of what sociologists have been suggesting, that this may reflect the status differences between whites and blacks. But we also do see that the relative levels or magnitude of prediction among our black respondents using these variables is still fairly weak overall. And at the same time, we do see that among whites, greater quality or higher quality contact with Mexican immigrants is predicting more positive attitudes towards immigration, that the effects of contact quality are partially mediated by apathy and to a lesser extent by empathy, at the same time as there are still those direct effects of quality contact. And this is leading us to think that future efforts to enhance whites' attitudes towards immigration should focus not only on empathy or their empathic concern regarding immigrants' experiences, but to also think about how to reduce apathy in particular, and how to perhaps encourage recognition of the relevance of immigrants' experiences to their own lives, that it is a problem they should be concerned about instead of thinking that it's nothing to do with them. So just to conclude, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project. Dina Okamoto and Helen Merrow are both sociologists at different universities, and Michael Jones Correa, a political scientist from the University of Pennsylvania. And I'd also like to thank our funders, Russell Sage and Carnegie. And thank you.